Good morning, Julie. Thanks for joining us today. My first question is, what do you like about your work?
Hi, Tom. Let's see. Well, I work what's called a portfolio career. So I mostly work as a sustainability consultant, and I'm a director, but actually of a tiny little company, which is just me. And then I join up with other little companies to do projects sometimes, or I work with customers who are known as clients. I also do some creative stuff. I make upcycled, which is sort of sustainable reusing of textiles and things, which is my creative side. I use creativity in both halves of my job. And sometimes I get to do both at the same time, which is nice. And I also do a little bit of what's called pro bono, which is free volunteering work as well. So I help my profession, and I try and help society by telling people about what I do and what I think is important. Let's see, what else do you want to know? My brain's just gone blank, sorry.
No, the question was, what do you like about your work?
That's it, thank you. So the thing that I really like about sustainability, it wasn't where I started. I started as an engineer, but I've always grown up on the edge of towns. I've always been connected to nature and been interested in animals. And I've always been interested in society. I grew up in a town in Essex called Shoebury, which had some quite well-off people and also some very poor people in it. So I've always been interested in how fair society is and whether, you can make it better. And in my 20s, I sort of realised that as an engineer, I was solving problems and doing useful things for society. I was always interested in science and technology, so I kind of get a big buzz out of doing technical things and solving problems and making things better. But sometimes they're not designed to make the planet a better place or to help people. Sometimes you design a whizzy product and that's all it is. It's a product so that the company can make money, and that's not really right. And you stack up all these problems, which now we know, and it's much more commonly seen. You see it all over the TV with David Attenborough, and you see it on the news. Climate change and pollution and plastic turning up in places that it shouldn't be. So I kind of realised that wasn't great. And then I started to realise there were other ways of doing what I already was doing as an engineer that involved this thing called sustainability. And the idea is you design and do things to either make things better, so you're actually actively making the habitat better, or you're helping animals or people in some way, or clearing up a problem, or you at least design your product or your service, whatever it is that you're doing, so that you don't make things worse. And that really hadn't been a thing in how most people do their job. So I started to look into that, and then I eventually retrained. I did another degree, a doctorate, when I was about 40. That was about 10 years ago. And that enabled me to change from just working with traditional kinds of jobs to working on sustainability projects. So what really gets me out of bed in the morning is the fact that most of what I do, even if it feels like it's meetings and sort of everyday work stuff, I'm trying to work with people who are trying to make things better in some way. I'm either helping a company that's only just starting to think about this and helping them do really basic stuff, which is where you can have a big impact. If someone's not really done it before, there's a lot of very, very simple things you can do. Just making them think about really basic stuff about not being wasteful or not traveling too much. And this year's been a really big help for some of that.
Yeah.
And getting people over we can't not have people in the office. And then suddenly we're all doing it. And actually, you know what? It works. So you can start to say to people, well, look, you can change stuff. Your company won't die. It's okay. And this will also help them as companies. So I quite like that it does both things. I'm solving a problem for society and the planet, and I'm also solving a problem for the business, which it may not realise it has. So some of the research that I did when I was doing my second degree was all about how that makes a company stronger. So it's nice to be able to have those arguments with them and say, look, this will actually make you better as well. And when times are bad, that will make you better able to survive, like now. Yeah. So all of that is good. And then also obviously a bit of creativity. And then I have this creative sideline as well. And sometimes I'm getting up to go into the studio and do some interesting piece of commission work for a customer, or someone set me a challenge, they want me to make something, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that, so I go off to the studio and see what I've got and how I can do that.
Excellent. How did you start out?
I was interested in quite a few different things at school, but I particularly liked science and technology. I happened to have a dad who was an engineering technician, and a mum who worked in a drawing office. So we were a moderately technical family, I guess. The rest of the family weren't particularly technical. So I grew up kind of knowing what engineering was, whereas at school, if you were good at science, the thought was that most girls, I went to a girls' school, had ponies and wanted to be vets. And that wasn't my thing at all. I was much more interested in spaceships and interesting gadgets and electricity and all sorts of things. So I went completely against the advice of practically everybody I knew and went to university to do engineering, because I had already had a thing where I wanted to do something useful, and going and working in a lab on physics was great, but kind of I couldn't see where it went. It was very, very interesting, and I have always read magazines and books about physics and cosmology and all that interesting stuff that Brian Cox talks about on the telly. But I sort of thought, but kind of how is it useful down here on the planet when people are going about their everyday life? My dad wasn't an industrial engineer working for a company until quite late on. But I just kind of had this idea of, well, if you're making a thing that people buy that's useful. So I went to university. Luckily at the time you could get sponsored. So I figured that was a good idea, because that meant my parents wouldn't have to pay for me to go to so much. At the time that I went, it was free, but you still needed a bit of help. But also being sponsored or having summer placements, engineering is practical. It's about solving problems. So you have all these lectures about all these lovely theoretical ideas, but then you have to actually learn, how do you do that in a company? How do you do it in a real factory? Because it's never quite the same. So I quite enjoyed. I spent 6 months of the year studying, and then 6 months with my sponsor working on actual things in the factory that they would let us near. Obviously, students, they don't let you do everything, but it was really good to actually get those skills of how to work with other people, how to be an actual proper practical engineer, so that when we eventually graduated, all those of us that were at that company, we were much better at it because we'd been already practicing. So I went to work for them afterwards. I worked a lot on, most of what we did was fuel systems for tractors and vans and all sorts of useful commercial vehicles. And later I swapped to a supplier company that supplied bits to cars made by people like Ford, which was kind of interesting because it was different and more complicated, but it was a lot less. It was more about kind of making people want to buy a car they didn't need, rather than a farmer buys a tractor and then they use it for 30 years, or a man with a van. The van really has to work because he's driving around delivering things or doing jobs for people like a builder. And it was all sort of getting into the, we're making people buy things they don't really necessarily want, and we're charging them lots of money for things that really they'll care about for 5 minutes, like the Go Faster stripe. And that started to make me a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I belonged to a network of women engineers, and somebody gave an amazing presentation about climate change, which I'd sort of been aware of, but not really understood. And I just had a huge light bulb moment of, oh, okay. And the next year she came back and she talked about something called peak oil, which we sort of haven't quite got into, which is where the demand for oil gets bigger much quicker than the supply. And then what happens when you haven't all got enough oil? And luckily we haven't sort of gone through that, but that was another resource-based thing. And I thought, okay, this is big. I need to go and understand about sustainability. It affects all the things that I treasure, like animals and the planet. And so I started to sort of educate myself. And then I sort of tried to, I did some training here and there, try to sort of affect the company from the inside. But if you work in a very big company, it's very difficult. And if they don't really want to do whatever it is that you think is a good idea in terms of a business, then it's really, really difficult to have any influence. So in the end, I thought, right, okay, I have to go and do something else. So over a period of years, I tried to move into different industries. And eventually thought, no, I have to do a qualification to show that I understand this stuff, because although I understand it, I don't have a piece of paper. So that's why I retrained. Yeah. So I had quite about almost a 20-year career as a sort of industrial engineer. And then I did this qualification where I worked with my home industry, ironically, the car industry, on sustainability and what it might mean for them and how they might do it and make better decisions. And that allowed me to step sideways into working with sustainable vehicles and things, so looking at how people run their fleets of vehicles in a company or organisation, and from there kind of into other sustainability things since. So I've worked with all different kinds of clients on anything from sort of the director saying, we need a strategy, what should we do, we don't even know where to start, to maybe looking at how much energy or fuel they're using and how they're using it, or helping them build a tool to make decisions, all sorts of things.
Excellent. And finally, what would you say to someone starting out today?
It's an interesting one. I think I've given careers talks all through my life, and the biggest thing that I say to people is the way that I got into something is not the only way to do it, particularly things like engineering. If you are academic and you are good at a particular area, then you might do A-levels and a degree. But I also know people who were really good, who honestly couldn't take exams at all. They just weren't, they either just don't have that kind of brain, or they're a person who learns by doing stuff with their hands, with their body, or they just had, they just didn't get on at school and they needed to be somewhere else, like a work environment. So you can learn by doing a job, by sort of working up to things. And that might be that you might start out in a shop and you might discover that you're good at fixing the computer, and then a bit like the Armed Forces advert, where he works in the butcher's but he realizes he wants to do something else and he gradually moves into other things. So what you start out as is not what you will spend your whole life doing necessarily, and even if you do a degree, you're not necessarily going to do that thing for the rest of your life. Like I haven't. I've changed what I do. And if you do A-levels and a degree and you realize that maybe you're in the wrong place, you can change, you can train, you can move across, you can get different jobs. So that flexibility, having trying things, seeing if you can do them, trying a different route if that route isn't for you. If you're not an exams person, look at practical stuff. There are practical training things like apprenticeships. And sustainability, which I know younger people are very much more into because they're so much more aware than my age group are, because they've grown up with climate change and things like that. There are lots and lots of different jobs. Sustainability isn't one career, it's the point of what your organisation is doing. So you could be an ordinary finance person or a lawyer or an office worker or an IT person, but you're working in an organisation whose purpose is sustainability, or it might be specific to helping with climate change, it might be about helping society, it might be a charity, it might be a council, whatever. So there's sort of two things, what your skill is and what you're using it to do. So you could be a finance person and you could use that skill to make yourself very rich in the city and make your rich clients richer, like Donald Trump. You can tell that I probably don't think that's a good idea. Or you could be using it to make a climate change charity work well, to make sure that their cash flows are good and that they can raise funds and that they do all their reports so that they're all correctly run. So you're helping someone through the skills that you've got. In my case, engineering, there's always a shortage of engineering people and technical people, and particularly sustainability. There are quite a lot of people that come at it from the business side, but because it is a complicated scientific thing, in some cases, you need people who understand that. So if you have a sciencey leaning or a human sciencey thing or a medical leaning or a society interest, there are lots of different disciplines around that can all feed into sustainability. And there are degrees and training courses specifically that look at that aspect, because some of it is quite complicated, but you do have to do the maths and understand how things go. And there's also a whole sort of side to it to do with policy and how governments do things and councils, for example. And that can be really interesting. Like, how do you get renewables out? How do you get those wind farms built where they need to be? How do you trade off between people who want renewable energy but don't want the wind turbine in their backyard, basically, or off of their beach, and all this sort of stuff? And that can be really interesting. And what happens after Brexit? That's quite important. So there's all these different areas. But in my case, engineering, there's always quite a lot of help around, particularly because there aren't enough women in scientific careers and maths careers. There is quite a lot of support there. There are days you can go on to find out more. There's lots of online resources. There's people like me who will come and talk to your school, or who, if you get in contact with certain organisations, they'll put you in touch with someone to sort of answer your questions. And the same goes for boys. We're quite happy to talk to the boys as well. I should stress that. So there's a lot of information there to sort of try and encourage to do it, because we always have a shortage of scientific and technical people. So tends to be reasonably well paid. Once you've got technical skills, you tend to have a job that will, you can move into different areas, but you'll tend to always be in employment. They are, the higher level jobs, you do need things like degrees, but there are different ways to do that. As I said, sometimes you can do a degree through a different route. You can do it in a more practical way. So if you're not an examsy person, it's not a problem. There are lots of routes in. So I don't know if that really answers the how do you get into it, but basically there's lots of different ways in, and there are lots of different people needed for sustainability. So creativity you can do as a hobby. I have always had creative hobbies, and sometimes I've had a job that's absolutely no creativity whatsoever, which I hated. But creativity, things you do in your other life, your hobbies and your home stuff, actually help you in your work life and your school life if you're still a student. So, don't discount all those useful things you do, like going out and talking to people. That's actually really, really interacting with other people and learning how to work them is really important. Going off and, being brilliant at exams is not going to get you into a fantastic job or career. You need all these other things. Yeah. So remember to be a whole human, do other stuff. Relate to the planet and people.
That's definitely good advice, Julie. A whole human. Thank you very much for your time today.